The first sign of trouble wasn't the letter. It wasn't even the SUV that crawled up my driveway like a predator sizing up its prey. It was the silence. An unnatural, heavy silence that made my skin prickle. The birds had stopped chirping, the leaves had stopped rustling, and even the wind held its breath as if the world itself knew something was coming. Toby, my German shepherd, let out a low growl, his body tense beside me on the porch. I didn't know why, but my gut told me, whatever was about to happen, it wasn't good. I wiped the sweat off my forehead, setting my wrench down on the hood of my truck. It was supposed to be just another day of fixing things around the property, enjoying the quiet life I had worked so hard to build. But as I watched the SUV doors swing open, I knew that peace was over. A woman stepped out, dressed in crisp, white business attire that didn't belong anywhere near a place like this. She adjusted her sunglasses, scanning my land like she owned it. Her movements were sharp, controlled, too precise, like she was here on a mission. And from the way her red-painted lips curled into a tight smirk, I could already tell I wasn't going to like what she had to say. She strode toward me with the confidence of someone who had already decided they were in charge. I didn't move, didn't speak, just let Toby's steady growl do the talking for me. The woman finally stopped a few feet away, tilting her head slightly, as if sizing me up. Then, without a single greeting, she said the words that would change everything. This land should belong to the community, and I'm here to make sure that happens. For a moment, I just stared at her. I must have misheard. This land? My land? The place I had bought with my hard-earned money? The place I had built with my own two hands? My lips parted, but I couldn't even find the words at first. Instead, I let out a short, humorless laugh, wiping my hands on my jeans as I stepped forward. You're kidding, right? I finally said, my voice flat. She didn't flinch, didn't waver. Her smirk deepened, like she was enjoying this. I assure you, I'm very serious. The Homeowners Association has reviewed the current layout of the area, and we believe this property is better suited as a shared recreational space. A park, if you will. A place for the community to enjoy nature. I blinked. I had heard a lot of nonsense in my life, but this was a new level of insanity. There is no homeowners association here, I said slowly, watching her reaction. Now, she did something that made my blood run cold. She smiled wider, as if she had been waiting for me to say that. Oh, but there is, she said, clasping her hands together. It was recently formed to oversee community regulations and improvements. And as per our new guidelines, privately owned land that serves no active purpose can be reassigned for the greater good. I felt something sharp coil in my chest. Anger. Not the quick, hot kind, but the slow, simmering kind that felt like it was sinking into my bones. Lady, I don't know who you think you are, but this is my land. I bought it. I own it. And no made-up HOA is going to tell me otherwise. Her expression didn't change. If anything, she looked amused, like I was a child throwing a tantrum over something inevitable. You'll find that the legal documents say otherwise, she said smoothly, pulling a neatly folded paper from her bag and holding it out to me. The county has already approved the reassignment process. You'll receive an official notice within the week. In the meantime, we suggest you begin making arrangements. Of course, if you choose to resist, there will be consequences. Toby barked sharply at her last word, his hackles raised, his teeth bared. My fingers curled into fists at my sides. This wasn't just some pushy neighbor complaining about fences or noise. This was a takeover, a full-scale attempt to steal what was mine, dressed up as community service. I didn't take the paper. I didn't even look at it. Instead, I took a slow, deliberate step forward, closing the distance between us until I was just within her personal space. Her smirk faltered just a fraction. You listen to me, I said, my voice quiet but firm. I don't care what fancy paperwork you shove in my face. I don't care what lies you tell the county. This land is mine, and if you, or anyone else, tries to take it from me, you're going to regret it. For the first time, a flicker of something crossed her face. Not fear, exactly, but surprise. Like she hadn't expected me to push back so quickly. But just as fast, she recovered, stepping back with a sigh, adjusting her sunglasses. "Suit yourself," she said breezily, turning back toward her car. "But don't say I didn't warn you." I watched her leave, my muscles coiled so tightly I thought I might snap. The SUV's tires kicked up a cloud of dust as it sped down the road, disappearing into the distance. I let out a slow breath, then turned to Toby, who was still on high alert. "This isn't over," I muttered, mostly to myself. And I was right, because the next morning, the real nightmare began. The next morning, I woke up to something that made my stomach drop. Pinned to my front door was a large, official-looking notice, printed in bold red letters. At first glance, it looked like some kind of legal document, the kind designed to intimidate people before they even read a word. As I ripped it off the wood and scanned the contents, my hands tightened around the edges. It was a formal declaration from the so-called Homeowners Association, stating that my land had been officially reassigned as a community green space. The language was full of legal jargon, but the meaning was clear. According to them, I no longer had full ownership of my own property. They were giving me 30 days to vacate so that development could begin. My pulse pounded in my ears as I read and reread the notice, trying to process the absurdity of it. This was illegal. It had to be. There was no way an HOA could just materialize out of nowhere and claim authority over my land. I hadn't signed anything, hadn't agreed to anything, hadn't even been notified that any of this was happening until that smug woman had shown up yesterday. My gut twisted as I realized just how serious they were. This wasn't just a threat to harass me into moving. They were coming after my home with real paperwork, real procedures, real legal backing, or at least the illusion of it. Toby barked from inside, sensing my tension, but I barely heard him as I marched back into the house and grabbed my phone. My first call was to the county office. I waited through several rings, my jaw clenched so tightly I thought my teeth might crack. Finally, a bored-sounding clerk picked up. I didn't waste time with pleasantries. I gave them my address, told them about the notice, and demanded to know what was going on. There was a pause on the other end, then the sound of keys clacking on a keyboard. My fingers tapped impatiently on the counter as I waited for an answer, my blood pressure climbing by the second. When the clerk finally spoke again, their voice was hesitant, like they were choosing their words carefully. They confirmed that, yes, my property had technically been annexed into an HOA, and that, yes, there was a file stating that the land had been designated for public use. But when I asked for details, for proof of how this had been approved without my consent, their response made my skin crawl. The HOA had been registered under a single name, the same woman who had shown up at my house yesterday. Apparently, she had filed a community petition, claiming that local residents had voted in favor of turning my land into a public park. The problem was, there were no local residents. My nearest neighbor lived miles away. There was no community to vote on anything. I gritted my teeth as I forced my voice to stay calm, asking them how something like this could even happen. The clerk sighed, muttering something about loopholes in property laws, about how sometimes petitions could be approved provisionally if no one disputed them within a certain time frame. My stomach dropped as the reality of it set in. The HOA had done this quietly, probably filed the paperwork while I was completely unaware, waited just long enough for the deadline to pass, and now they were trying to hit me with an eviction notice before I could fight back. It was calculated, deliberate. They had played the system perfectly to trap me. My hand tightened around my phone as I asked one final question. The one thing that mattered most. Was there a way to fight this? The clerk hesitated again before finally admitting that yes, I could file an appeal. But it wouldn't be easy. It would require legal action, time, and money. And if the HOA was willing to fake a community petition, there was no telling what else they were willing to do to keep their claim standing. I barely heard the rest of what they said before I hung up, my mind already racing ahead. I needed a lawyer. Fast. But before I could even start looking, I noticed something out the window that made my anger surge to a whole new level. The woman, her, was back. And she wasn't alone. I stormed outside, my heart hammering as I saw them. 3 men stood beside her, dressed in cheap security uniforms, the kind that were supposed to look official but meant absolutely nothing. One of them was holding a clipboard, glancing around my land as if he were already making plans for what to do with it once I was gone. The woman herself stood with her arms crossed, that same smug smirk on her face, as if she had already won. My fists clenched as I closed the distance between us, but before I could say anything, she casually gestured to the clipboard in the man's hands. She told me that this was a preliminary assessment, that they were simply here to survey the land in preparation for the transition. Then, as if she hadn't just dropped a bombshell, she tilted her head and politely asked if I'd like to start discussing relocation options. I had never wanted to hit someone so badly in my life. I took a deep breath, barely keeping my temper in check as I told them to get the hell off my property. The woman sighed dramatically, as if I was being unreasonable. She reminded me that I had been formally notified, that legal action was already in motion, and that fighting back would only delay the inevitable. When I still didn't budge, she gestured to the security men, telling them to document the property while she handled me. The men started walking through my land, taking notes, looking around as if they already owned the place. That's when I snapped. Without thinking, I grabbed my phone and dialed the sheriff's office. The woman's expression flickered with the briefest hint of surprise, but she quickly masked it, tilting her head with amusement. She asked me if I really thought the police were going to do anything about this. After all, she had the paperwork, the county's approval, and the weight of a legally recognized HOA behind her. But I wasn't playing her game. I told the dispatcher exactly what was happening, emphasizing that these people were on my land without my permission, that they were refusing to leave, and that they were actively trespassing. The woman's amusement faded slightly when I mentioned that last part. Maybe she had expected me to just roll over, to accept that I had already lost. Maybe she thought I wouldn't have the guts to push back. But she had underestimated just how far I was willing to go to protect what was mine. The dispatcher told me that a deputy would be sent out immediately. The woman's expression darkened slightly as she signaled for her men to stop what they were doing. She straightened her jacket, then told me, in a tone that was far too calm, that this wouldn't end well for me. Then, with a final smirk, she turned on her heel and walked back to her SUV, her security goons trailing behind her. I watched as they drove away, the dust from their tires lingering in the air like a warning. My pulse was still racing, my entire body tense, but I refused to let myself feel defeated. They thought they could intimidate me into giving up. They thought that, just because they had manipulated the system, I would roll over and let them steal my home. But they had just made a huge mistake. They had pushed too hard, too fast. And now, they had gotten the police involved. They thought this was already over. They had no idea that it was just getting started. The wait for the sheriff's deputy felt longer than it should have. My pulse was still hammering in my ears, my muscles tense as I paced back and forth on my porch, eyes fixed on the long dirt road leading up to my property. Toby sat by my feet, ears twitching every time the wind rustled the trees, sensing the shift in the air. He wasn't barking anymore, but he wasn't calm either. He could feel it too. This wasn't over. Not by a long shot. When I finally saw the flashing red and blue lights cresting the hill, a mix of relief and anger coursed through me. Relief that help was finally here. Anger that it had even come to this. The patrol car pulled up, kicking up dust as it came to a slow stop near my driveway. The door opened, and out stepped a broad-shouldered man in his 40s, his uniform crisp, his badge glinting under the midday sun. His name tag read Deputy Callahan, and from the way he moved, calm but deliberate, I could tell he'd been doing this a long time. He adjusted his belt as he approached, his eyes scanning my land with the sharpness of someone who had seen more than his fair share of trouble. I didn't wait for him to speak. I stepped forward, holding up the eviction notice I had torn off my door earlier. My grip so tight the paper had crumpled at the edges. I told him everything. About the woman, about the fake HOA, about the so-called community vote that never happened. I explained how she had shown up with hired security, how they had trespassed on my land and started surveying it like it already belonged to them. I told him how the county office had confirmed that my property had been annexed without my knowledge, how they had manipulated loopholes in the system to make it look legal. And finally, I told him about the threats, how she had made it clear that resisting would only make things worse for me. Callahan listened without interrupting, his expression unreadable, his eyes moving between me, my house, and the stretch of land behind it. When I was finished, he took the notice from my hand and skimmed it, his brow furrowing slightly as he read. He let out a slow breath, then asked if I had security cameras. I admitted that I didn't. Not yet. He nodded, then folded the notice neatly before tucking it into his pocket. Then, in a level voice, he told me something that sent a cold spike of fury down my spine. He told me that this wasn't the first time he had heard of something like this happening, that over the past year, there had been multiple reports of private properties being quietly absorbed into newly formed HOAs, that most of the time, homeowners never fought back. They either didn't have the money for legal battles or didn't realize what was happening until it was too late. He told me that once an HOA gets county approval, reversing it is like pulling teeth, and that people like this woman, the ones who manufactured HOAs out of thin air, knew exactly what they were doing. I clenched my jaw, my fingers curling into fists at my sides. I already knew they had planned this carefully. But hearing Callahan say it, hearing him confirm that this wasn't just some fluke but an intentional, well-orchestrated scam, made my blood boil. He told me that while technically the police couldn't override a county-approved HOA, there were still legal boundaries they had to follow. They couldn't harass me, they couldn't force an eviction before the process was finalized, and most importantly, they couldn't trespass without a formal court order. If they did, that was a criminal offense. And that was something Callahan could act on. That was what I needed to hear. I asked him what I could do next, what my best option was to stop this before it spiraled out of control. He told me to lawyer up immediately, to challenge the HOA in court before they had a chance to solidify their claim. He told me to document everything, dates, times, interactions, anything that could be used as evidence that I was being targeted. He told me to get security cameras installed tonight, because if this woman was willing to send people onto my land once, she'd do it again. And finally, he told me that if she or her security tried to step foot on my property again without a warrant, I had every right to call him, and he would personally escort them off my land. That was the first real sense of power I had felt since this nightmare began. I thanked him, shaking his hand firmly before he headed back to his patrol car. He told me he'd keep a report on file in case things escalated, then tipped his hat slightly before driving off, leaving me standing in the dust of his departure. As soon as he was gone, I pulled out my phone and started making calls. First, I found a lawyer, Ethan Price, a real estate attorney with a reputation for tearing apart corrupt HOAs. When I told him my situation, he didn't even sound surprised. He told me to email him everything. The notice, the county documents, even the footage from my security cameras once I had them set up. He told me that I had a fight ahead of me, but it wasn't impossible to win. The next thing I did was drive into town to buy security cameras. I picked up multiple sets, ones with night vision, motion detection, and automatic cloud backups. If they tried anything, if they so much as stepped onto my land again, I would have them on video. I spent the rest of the evening installing them, one facing the driveway, one covering the front porch, another near the fence line, and one overlooking the back of the house. By the time I was finished, the sun had dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows across the land. Toby paced restlessly beside me, his tail low, his ears flicking at every sound. I knew exactly how he felt. I had done everything I could for now. I had the police involved, I had a lawyer, I had cameras. But deep down, I knew this wasn't the end. If anything, I had only escalated things. This woman had come in expecting compliance, expecting me to roll over and accept that my home had been stolen out from under me. She had tried to intimidate me, to make it seem like I had no choice. But now, I had done the one thing she didn't want me to do. I had fought back, and if I knew anything about people like her, it was that they hated losing. I locked up the house, double-checking the security feeds before heading to bed. But sleep didn't come easily. Every creak of the house, every distant rustle outside made my nerves tighten. My mind kept replaying the events of the day, kept spinning through possibilities of what she would do next. Because I knew she wasn't finished. I knew that someone who had gone through this much effort to steal my land wouldn't just walk away. And I was right. Because at exactly 3:17 a.m., Toby's deep, guttural growl pulled me out of sleep. The house was dark, the only light coming from the faint glow of my security monitor. I reached for my phone, blinking away the grogginess as I checked the camera feeds. My stomach dropped. There was movement near the fence line, a dark figure, lurking, watching. And then, just as my pulse started to spike, the screen flickered as a new alert popped up. Motion detected, front porch. My breath caught in my throat as I stared at the screen. The figure at the fence had barely moved, lingering just beyond the boundary of my property, but the real threat was closer. The front porch alert meant someone was right outside my door. My pulse pounded as I switched cameras, my fingers moving quickly over the screen. The grainy night vision feed flickered for a second before sharpening, and there it was, a shadow standing at the edge of the porch, just outside the frame of my motion light. Whoever they were, they knew exactly where to stand to avoid triggering it. Toby let out another low growl from his spot near the bed, his body stiff, ears pinned back. He could sense it too. Whoever was out there wasn't here by accident. The hair on the back of my neck stood up as I gritted my teeth, forcing myself to think. I wasn't about to make the mistake of walking outside blindly, not when I had no idea what I was dealing with. My phone was still in my hand, my thumb already hovering over the sheriff's number. I tapped the screen and pressed it to my ear, my other hand tightening around the handle of the baseball bat I kept by the door. The dial tone barely rang twice before a voice answered. The dispatcher on the other end was quick, professional, asking me to confirm the situation. I kept my voice low, explaining that there was an intruder on my property and possibly another one at the fence. The woman on the line immediately assured me that a patrol car was on the way, and as I watched the screen, my jaw clenched. The person at the fence hadn't moved, still just standing there. But the one on the porch, they were trying the door. A slow, deliberate turn of the handle. My pulse spiked as I tightened my grip on the bat. The door was locked, the deadbolt in place. But that didn't stop the unsettling feeling that crept up my spine. Whoever this was, they weren't just trespassing. They were testing me, seeing how far they could push before I reacted. My breathing stayed steady as I backed away slightly, still keeping my eyes locked on the screen. The figure on the porch hesitated for a moment, as if realizing the door wouldn't budge, then slowly turned toward the camera. A woman. Even in the dim lighting, I could recognize the sharp features, the perfectly styled blonde hair, the cold amusement in her expression. It was her, the HOA woman, the same one who had tried to intimidate me earlier, the one who had filed the fraudulent petition to steal my land. But what sent a fresh wave of anger through me wasn't the fact that she was here. It was the fact that she wasn't even trying to hide it. She was standing right in front of my camera, smirking, as if daring me to do something. My fingers curled tighter around my phone as the dispatcher told me the deputies were minutes away. I kept my voice level as I confirmed that the intruder was now identified. The woman was still standing there, unmoving, staring directly into the camera with that same smug expression, and then she reached into her coat pocket. My muscles tensed, adrenaline spiking. I couldn't see what she was pulling out, but I wasn't about to wait to find out. My other hand shot toward the light switch, flipping on the floodlights that surrounded my property. In an instant, the entire front yard was bathed in bright, unforgiving light, and for the first time, I saw exactly what I was dealing with. There were more of them. 3 more figures stood near the tree line, just beyond the fence. The one from the porch, the woman, flinched slightly at the sudden brightness but didn't back away. Instead, she tilted her head, slipping whatever was in her pocket back inside, as if deciding this wasn't the right time. Then, in an eerily calm and deliberate motion, she stepped backward, down the porch steps, her heels clicking lightly against the wood. She didn't run. She didn't look startled. She simply retreated, turning her back as she walked toward the fence line. The others followed her. My chest heaved as I exhaled sharply, my hands still tight around the bat and my phone. The dispatcher was still on the line, asking for updates, and I told her exactly what had happened. That the intruders were retreating, that they had been standing way too close to my house for comfort, that I had them all on camera. But the thing that kept clawing at my mind, that made my gut twist in a way I didn't like, was how calm she had been. This wasn't a failed break-in. This wasn't a random act of intimidation. This had been a message. Toby was still growling lowly, watching the screen as the figures disappeared beyond the fence. Seconds later, The sound of approaching sirens filled the air. A sharp beam of headlights cut through the darkness, and soon after, two sheriff's cruisers pulled up, their lights flashing as deputies stepped out, scanning the area with sharp eyes. I wasted no time explaining what had happened, showing them the footage, pointing toward the fence line where the woman and her people had disappeared. Deputy Callahan was there again, his face unreadable as he watched the footage replay on my phone. His jaw tightened slightly when he saw her, but the real change in his expression came when I told him how she had tried the door handle. His eyes darkened as he exchanged a glance with the other deputy, then told me they would file an official trespassing report and start looking into criminal harassment charges. But the real problem, he admitted, was the legal gray area. Since the HOA had technically been recognized by the county, this woman wasn't just some random trespasser. She was someone with a documented claim to my land, however fraudulent it was. If she had a legal angle, she could argue that she was simply checking on community property, even though we both knew that was complete nonsense. Callahan told me that they would start investigating how the petition was filed, but it wouldn't be a fast process. These things never were. That was exactly what she was counting on, dragging this out, making it as difficult and stressful as possible, trying to wear me down with endless paperwork and legal maneuvering until I gave up. I clenched my jaw, staring out at the now empty land beyond the fence, my mind already racing ahead. I wasn't giving up. Not now. Not ever. If she wanted to play dirty, then so be it. Because she had just crossed a line she couldn't take back. This wasn't just about property anymore. This was war. The next morning, I woke up with a purpose. The fear and uncertainty that had been lingering in the back of my mind were gone, replaced with something far stronger: determination. Last night had confirmed what I already knew. The woman and her so-called HOA weren't just playing legal games anymore. They were escalating, pushing their boundaries, testing just how far they could go before I broke. But what they didn't realize was that they had just made their biggest mistake. They had underestimated me. I started my day by making two important phone calls. The first was to my lawyer, Ethan Price. I sent him every bit of evidence I had: the security footage, the police report from last night, the fake eviction notice, and the fraudulent paperwork they had filed with the county. He responded within an hour, telling me that we had enough grounds to formally challenge the HOA's legitimacy in court. It would take time, but the case was strong. If we proved that the HOA was formed without a valid community vote, their entire legal claim would collapse. But more importantly, the trespassing and harassment charges were criminal, not just civil, which meant law enforcement could take immediate action. The second call was to the sheriff's department. This time, I wasn't just reporting a trespassing incident. I was filing for a restraining order against the woman who had tried to break into my house. The footage of her standing on my porch, trying the door handle, was more than enough evidence to prove intent. The sheriff's office processed my request quickly, and within a few hours, a deputy had delivered formal notice to the HOA's so-called headquarters, which, unsurprisingly, was just the woman's personal home in town. That should have been the end of it, but it wasn't. By the afternoon, a new letter appeared in my mailbox. This one wasn't an eviction notice. It wasn't a legal threat. It was a fine. A $5,000 fine for failure to comply with HOA regulations. My grip tightened around the paper as I read through the absurd claims. They were accusing me of unauthorized fencing, unapproved landscaping, and, most ridiculous of all, refusal to vacate designated community land. The nerve. The sheer audacity. They were still trying to bleed me dry, even after last night, even after law enforcement had gotten involved. I didn't hesitate. I grabbed my truck keys and drove straight to the county office, the letter still clenched in my hand. The clerks at the front desk looked up as I stormed in, and it wasn't long before I was sitting in front of the county commissioner, laying out every single fraudulent action the HOA had taken against me. The commissioner, a gruff-looking man in his 60s, skimmed through the paperwork with an increasingly deep frown. When I mentioned that the sheriff's office was already involved, his expression hardened. And that's when I saw it, the moment of realization in his eyes. This wasn't the first complaint against this HOA. I pressed him for details, and after a moment of hesitation, he admitted that my case wasn't the only one. Over the past year, multiple similar reports had surfaced. private properties suddenly being annexed, homeowners receiving bogus fines and eviction notices. Most of them had given up, either selling their land or settling under the HOA's ridiculous terms just to avoid legal battles. But now that the sheriff's office was directly involved, now that I was pushing back with evidence, the county was forced to take a second look. The commissioner promised to launch a full review of the HOA's status, but I wasn't leaving it at that. I made it clear. I was taking this all the way to court, and when I won, I wasn't just going to get my land back. I was going to dismantle their entire operation. The next few days were tense. I installed more cameras, reinforced my fences, and stayed in constant contact with Ethan. The restraining order meant the HOA woman couldn't legally set foot on my property, but that didn't mean she was done playing her games. She was losing control, and people like her didn't handle that well. Then, on the fourth night, it happened. It was past midnight when my security alert went off. The back fence, a section of it had been cut open. My heart slammed in my chest as I bolted to the monitors, scanning the feeds. The figures were back, 3 of them, moving fast, wearing dark clothing, slipping onto my land like they thought they were invisible. But this time, I was ready. I grabbed my phone, dialed the sheriff's office, and told them exactly what was happening. Then, before they could even get here, I turned on the floodlights and activated the siren. The entire yard lit up like a stadium, a deafening alarm blaring through the night. The intruders froze, and for the first time, they panicked. They tried running, but it was too late. The sheriff's deputies arrived within minutes, blocking off the road as officers swarmed the property. 2 of the intruders made it back through the fence, disappearing into the woods, but one wasn't fast enough. He was tackled to the ground, restrained, and shoved into the back of a patrol car before he even had a chance to fight back. And when they pulled off his mask, my suspicions were confirmed. He was one of the HOA's hired security goons. The woman had sent them. That was the final piece of evidence we needed. With a recorded break-in attempt, an eyewitness report, and footage of HOA-affiliated personnel committing a crime, the sheriff's office had no choice but to act. By morning, the police had a warrant for the HOA woman's arrest. She was picked up from her home before noon, handcuffed, and booked for criminal trespassing, conspiracy to commit vandalism, and multiple counts of harassment. The moment the news hit the county office, the entire HOA was shut down. Her fraudulent petition was overturned. Every illegal fine, every bogus restriction, every false eviction notice she had ever issued was declared void. The county launched a full investigation into how she had been manipulating property laws, and before long, even more homeowners came forward with their own horror stories. She had spent over a year scamming people out of their land, but now she was facing serious jail time. And just like that, it was over. The peace I had fought so hard to protect was finally restored. My land was mine again, legally and unquestionably. The signs, the notices, the fake legal threats, they were gone. The HOA was dead. The woman who had tried to steal my home was rotting in a cell, her empire crumbling around her. A month later, I sat on my porch, watching the sun set over my property, Toby lying at my feet, his tail lazily thumping against the wooden planks. For the first time in weeks, there was no tension in my shoulders, no paranoia lurking in the back of my mind. Just peace. Real, undeniable peace. And as I took a slow sip of my coffee, I smiled. Because in the end, she lost.